I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Liberty Nation Swamponomics videocast. I am Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor. This week, it's all Vladimir Putin's fault.
Yes!
Sorry. It is corporate America's fault.
Yes!
No, wait, never mind. It is actually the mom and pop gasoline station's fault. Well, you get the point. Since the consumer price index started spiraling out of control, the current administration went from ignoring it to dismissing it to blaming everyone else for it. While inflation remains around 3%, prices still remain well above pre-pandemic levels. In fact, the new concession is that prices will never go back down to where they were, despite the official talking point that inflation has been vanquished from the United States economy. So, who is to blame, and is inflation gone? John Klar, Liberty Nation's national correspondent, is out with a new article that looks at the good old-fashioned blame game of inflation. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
What is the administration saying nowadays about inflation?
Well, interestingly, they've kind of been backing off on it even existing. You may have seen a recent controversy, which I don't cover in the piece, where President Biden has claimed that inflation is now below 2% again. And that was accomplished through a statistical sleight of hand, which even fact checkers have said is disingenuous and confusing to voters. When we look at all of the usual standards that we look at, we're still in inflation territory. It does seem to have subsided, but I, for one, over the years have become increasingly distrustful of the government to generate reliable figures, especially entering into an election year. But so the Biden administration blames on everybody. And when they're not doing so, the mainstream media will join in. And as I document a couple of examples in the article, it's amazing just how far these children will go to blame others for what they've done to our candy store while we allowed them to have the till.
Yeah, it's funny when they talk about inflation and they love to focus on specific metrics to support their case. I remember Paul Krugman, he's a Keynesian economist, and a few months ago he was saying that inflation was defeated if you don't look at higher house prices, higher energy prices, higher food prices, so on and so higher used vehicles. So they're saying that inflation is gone if you don't start looking at the things that really matter to the average person. In your article, do you dive into who is really to blame for the inflation mess?
Well, I do and I don't. I think I more raise the issue that the elephant in the living room, which is monetary policy, is entirely ignored each time responsibility is deflected to Russia, the consumer, supply chains. I also try to hold forth the idea in the article that there are, to the extent there are other contributors to inflation, in addition to money supply, that those often are also emanating from Biden policies, such as sanctions against Russia, which drives up prices, which they then blame on Russia. Increases in fuel prices, which were happening prior to the Ukraine conflict. There's a credibility problem here. But as far as the ultimate causes, I certainly look at the rudimentary economics of it, which is Milton Friedman, and that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary policy issue, in essence. And when you pump too much money into an economy, you cause inflation. And that would actually explain why we see it coming down now as well. The rush of the junkie injection is wearing off. And if the economy does rebound for whatever reason, I mean, that's a separate issue, then you might not need another shot in the arm. But it's totally disingenuous. And even those who critiqued in support of the Biden administration attributed through many economists that probably half or more of the inflation we saw at the peak was directly attributable to money supply from issuing too much money, sending everybody checks. Sending consumers $1,400 checks and they were sitting at home spending the money. Well, that had a lot to do with backing up the supply chains that were then blamed for causing the inflation. It's a bigger picture, but it all leads back to the Biden administration being responsible for that, which they say they're not responsible for, or even say doesn't exist, because if you just measure inflation without measuring anything, then there's no inflation.
when the pandemic first started, all this money was being injected to the economy from the Fed and from the CARES Act under Trump. Liberty Nation was right there warning that this would create an inflation bomb. And look, lo and behold, that's what happened. You look at the M2 money supply. It's a measurement of all the money in circulation, and you see that $6-7 trillion was just injected into a closed economy over about an 18-month period. That's astounding. Of course, that's going to lead to inflationary effects. It's very frustrating because they're just lying to you, or if they're trying to gaslight you when all the data is in front of you. And I guess that's what they want to do. They bank on people not looking at the numbers.
I linked to your article about that. You've done two previous pieces about this blame game, blaming Putin, this very same subject. We've just sort of brought it forward and updated it and continued to fortify our arguments with proof that it's a spoof, that it's a joke. But there's a deeper thing here, which is in the neo-Marxist onslaught against all things American and good that we're witnessing, it extends to money. The idea of universal income, the idea that you can just print money. But in Marxist ideology, that's what you do. You destroy so you can rebuild. Whether you do it unwittingly, whether you actually think you can give everybody universal money and play Monopoly where everybody gets to live on Boardwalk, Orwell spoke against this fantasy. It's unraveling. Is it a deliberate or unwitting destruction of our currency? And as I hint at in the article, there have been some famous examples of hyperinflation, but one need not go off that cliff to understand that this has had this impact. It has permanently compromised the value of people's retirement accounts. I think Americans are seeing through this. And as I say, it's not that a pickup truck is worth $75,000. It's that the dollar is only worth half of what it was when you bought a pickup truck for $37,500. People are starting to understand this.
In part 2 of my interview with John Klar of Liberty Nation, we will be discussing what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell are saying about inflation and if the inflation beast has been vanquished. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.